Hello and welcome to this online session for basic self-harm awareness for parents and carers. I'm Vicky from the Child Health Team at Medway Council and I will be delivering this session for you today. Just some things for us to consider before we start the session today. Self-harm can be an emotive and personal subject and we will all have our own views and experiences about it. Please keep yourself safe during the session today. Pause the video and please take a break away if you need to. Also think about a trusted person that you can talk to at the end of the session if you feel that you need to. During this session today, we will be looking at the definition and characteristics of self-harm, types of self-harm, and what risk factors and circumstances may lead to self-harm, as well as behavioural and physical warning signs. We will also look at the self-harm cycle as well as harm minimisation in supporting to reduce self-harming behaviour. Finally, we will look at ways parents and carers can help and support, as well as further support available for self-harm. So what is self-harm? You will see on the screen there are two quotes. If we consider these as a collective definition, we can see that self-harm isn't just about the physical act of hurting yourself, but it considers the reasons why people might self-harm. This is really important when we look at the cycle of self-harm later on in this session. We want to try and understand the reasons or triggers for self-harm so we can work on breaking that cycle and supporting to develop other healthy coping strategies. Self-harm is an umbrella term. It covers self-injury such as cutting or burning. Harming behaviour could also include over-exercising, provoking fights and ingesting harmful substances. Self-harm doesn't always take the most obvious forms and can also include other behaviours which are considered indirect self-harm. These may include eating disorders, including anorexia, bulimia and binge eating disorder, self-neglect, for example, a lack of self-care or engaging in risky physical and sexual behaviours, as well as excessive alcohol or substance misuse, including prescribed medications. Some acts, such as headbanging and hitting walls, are behaviours more commonly associated with autism spectrum condition, ASC, and other learning disabilities. This type of self-injury behaviour may not be intentional self-harm. It could be trying to communicate an unmet need, particularly if an individual has limited communication skills. For example, they are bored or thirsty but cannot verbalise this. Stimming is repetitive, unusual movements or noises that can help people with ASC to regulate their emotions and process their sensory environment. Some of these may be seen as unintentional acts of self-harm. Stimming is often a way of managing a situation and reducing stress, and so it shouldn't be stopped or reduced, but it should be monitored if it is causing harm. Many of us will engage in harming behaviours, such as driving over 30 miles an hour in a 30 zone or doing over 70 miles an hour on the motorway, but this is usually to a degree that is not detrimental to our health. Therefore, it is important to consider what makes the behaviour harmful and are some behaviours more harmful than others. When we are talking about self-harm, we need to consider the following. The severity. Are the marks and injuries being caused superficial or requiring immediate medical care? How were they caused? We also need to look at the frequency and duration. How often does the person harm themselves? Is it more than once a day, every week? And how long have they been harming? And we also want to be considering the impact this has on functioning. Is it impacting on them going to school, for example, taking part in certain lessons, maybe PE if they've got to undress or engage with others, activities including swimming or socialising, and wearing clothes they like because they might not want to show certain parts of their body, such as arms or legs. As we can see, there are lots of different reasons why people may self-harm, and this is by no means a definitive list. Reasons for self-harm will be individual to each person, and the reasons they self-harm may also change over time depending on the triggers and the circumstances for these. There are many different risk factors for self-harm. Some include being female, for example, hormonal changes including menstrual cycle or PMDD, premenstrual dysmorphic disorder, a very severe form of PMS that can cause extreme emotional and physical symptoms a week or two before a period. Children in care and young carers are at greater risk, as well as those with SEND needs, disabilities, and eating disorders. Those who have experienced adverse childhood experiences, which can include bereavement, alcohol dependency in the family, drug abuse, trauma, witnessing domestic abuse, neglect, prejudice including racism, financial hardship, if there is a family history of mental health issues, can also pose a greater risk. Those with divorced or separated parents or poor relationship or those in family conflict can also be at greater risk, as well as those involved in the criminal justice system. The LGBTQ plus community or those questioning sexual orientation or gender identity are also at higher risk for self-harm. Other risk factors might include having friends that harm as part of a peer group, those experiencing bullying or cyberbullying, difficult circumstances such as transitioning to a new school or area, or pressure to do well at school. Health inequalities can also increase the risk if access to support is limited, for example, trying to get a GP appointment for further support with mental health and well-being. Children and young people often hide their self-harm, but there are several signs listed here that could suggest that they are self-harming. For example, unexplained cuts, bruises or burns, becoming withdrawn or isolated, and sudden behavioural changes, as well as absence or lateness at school, or low mood and lack of interest in usual activities. There are also some things as parents and carers that you can look out for at home. For example, bloodstains on clothing, bedding or towels, finding blood-soaked tissues or sharp instruments. Listen to your intuition as parents and carers. If you have a hunch that your child is struggling, you might be right, and we will talk about how to approach them later on in this session. It is important to note the signs of self-harm can be similar to those of physical abuse. For example, cigarette burns or bruises could be inflicted by someone else. If these injuries do not appear to be consistent with the child's account of how they were sustained, this needs to be explored further to ensure that no one is harming them. This is the self-harm cycle. As we can see at the top of the cycle, there will be negative emotions, which could be from something that has just happened, low confidence or self-esteem, or from reliving trauma or a past experience. Once we experience those negative emotions, there can be an increase in distress and anxiety at the top of the cycle, resulting in a build-up of tension, both emotionally and physically. Our bodies can feel different, increased heart rate, feeling sick or dizzy, for example. To relieve this tension and these overwhelming emotions, a form of self-harm takes place. By doing so, it releases tension and endorphins, the same endorphins we get from something healthy like exercise. Once self-harm has taken place, feelings of guilt or shame will start to kick in, and then the addictive cycle starts again. With this cycle in mind, it is hard to see how it will stop, but we can support children and young people at the top of the cycle when they are experiencing emotional and physical distress. We can hold space and reassure them we are here to listen, not to judge or add any guilt or shame, and we can support them when they are ready. We can also encourage them to use distraction and coping techniques to delay self-harming behaviour and help to break the cycle, which we will look at later on in this session. It is our job as parents and carers to protect our children, and the news that they have been harming themselves can be devastating and difficult for us to hear. We will instantly want to make things better and for them not to harm at all. As hard as this may be, we need to accept this is unlikely to happen overnight. Self-harm is an addictive cycle of behaviour which helps children and young people to cope and to feel in control. For some, taking away this coping mechanism can be so overwhelming it could actually make their self-harm worse. The National Institute for Health and Care Excellence talks about harm minimisation, which aims to maximise safety when children and young people cannot stop self-harming immediately. Harm minimisation considers that if self-harm does have to occur, it should be done in a way that causes the least damage and involves good first aid and aftercare. We should never ask them to promise to stop. Instead, we should support them to reduce and manage risk. By taking away their coping mechanism, we are conveying that it is not okay for them to feel like this. If you take away the means from someone who wants to harm to feel better, they will more than likely find something else to use that may be more harmful and is not clean or sterile. Teaching them about using clean instruments or equipment will minimise risk. We want to advise them that there is no safe way to self-poison, and the impact is different on every individual, depending on what they have taken, as well as factors including metabolism, weight, what they have eaten or drunk, as well as existing health needs. We also want to ensure they are aware of risks to particular parts of the body. For example, if they do harm, to avoid areas like main arteries and veins, which could cause significant bleeding if cutting, for example. Something as seemingly simple as being reminded of coping mechanisms can really help to diffuse stress. For example, listening to music, talking to a friend, going for a walk, playing a computer game. These will all depend on the individual. As a harm minimisation strategy, a child or young person could agree a safe word with a friend or carer that could be spoken, written, or sent via text. This word would mean self-harm has taken place and help is needed without explanation at that time. Discovering that children and young people are self-harming can be very upsetting. As parents and carers, you may experience a range of emotions, including anger, sadness, helplessness, or shame. It can be distressing and difficult to know what to do. It is completely normal to feel strong emotions, and for us as adults, it's important to try and understand and accept them so that we don't risk transferring these emotions when we are trying to support with self-harm. Try to think of self-harming behaviour as an expression of deep emotions that cannot be handled in any other way at this time. When we are talking about self-harm, there are some things that we need to consider. It is helpful to reflect on our own feelings about self-harm before discussing it, so they do not get in the way of a positive and meaningful conversation. We need to remember what feelings belong to us so we can fully support our children. We want to ensure that our child is the sole focus of our attention, making sure we have time or that we make time. We understand that life is busy, but we want to make sure that they feel valued and listened to. We also want to actively listen here, so not just what they are telling us verbally, but what they are saying by their body language. Be aware that they may express some intense thoughts and feelings, and our role is to affirm and validate their feelings. Try to focus on the child and not the behaviour. Often children and young people do want to talk about it. Reassure them that you are here to listen and help where you can. Talking about it helps them to process their thoughts. The talking needs to be led by them. They may be open and then they may close down again, and we need to go with it, as frustrating as that can be. We also need to be led by them and go at their pace. If they do change the subject, again go with it. Try to keep the conversation flowing. Activities alongside talking can also be helpful. For example, drawing or playing a game whilst you talk, or even a drive in the car, depending on what works for them. It really does matter what we say and how we say it. Reframing language is crucial. We all need to feel heard, valued, and not judged. It is better to take our time to figure out our responses rather than use unhelpful language. As you can see on the screen, there are examples of unhelpful and helpful language which can really impact on engaging conversations and providing support. For example, you must feel very overwhelmed, and managing those feelings must be hard is much more helpful than saying, "Why have you done this to yourself?" Some other examples of helpful language include, "I know that sometimes people hurt themselves as a way of coping with difficulties, and I wonder if you would like to talk to me. I'm here when you want to chat." Sometimes when people are in a lot of emotional pain, they may hurt themselves as a way of coping. Is this how your injury happened? If self-harm could talk, what would it say? The reaction children and young people receive when they tell someone about their self-harm can have a critical impact on whether they go on to receive support, either from you or other services. So we really need to be mindful of our approach. We need to provide love and reassurance and remind them of their strengths, things we often forget when we are struggling. We want to encourage them to find other ways to manage, and we can support them with this, as well as reminding them that their thoughts and feelings will change over time. Some people who self-harm may be suicidal. If your child speaks to you about suicide, or there are any indicators of this, confront the issue in a non-judgmental way and discuss this openly together. Asking about suicide does not give a person ideas that they do not already have. There is no evidence to suggest that talking about suicide will encourage them further. Asking is more beneficial than harmful. If your child shares thoughts of suicide, continue listening and ask open questions. Administer first aid if needed, and if at risk of immediate harm, contact emergency services. Confidentiality is still as key for parents and carers as it is in an educational setting. As parents and carers, we will instantly want to solve what is going on for our children, but we must also remember we have a duty of care to them, and it is important to be as open with them about the next steps as we can. Following on from your conversation, you may suggest that they visit the GP to talk about their self-harm and what support they can access. You can offer to go with them, depending on their age and understanding, but they may wish to go alone or with another relative. As hard as this can be, try not to take it personally and be positive about them wanting to access support. We may have to accept that our children might not want to speak to us directly about their self-harm. Again, this can feel devastating for us as parents and carers, and it's very difficult not to take this personally. But they may be worried about opening up, feel judged, or that no one understands them. Sometimes it's easier to confide in people who aren't as close as parents and carers. For example, a teacher they have a good relationship with at school, a friend, or sometimes even strangers, as they may feel they will not be judged. All we can do is encourage and offer a safe space. Keep checking in, show them that we notice them, and provide that consistency. We all need attention sometimes. It's part of being human, and it's a need that we all have. In summarising, we want to be available for them. We want to ask them what support they want, depending on their age and understanding, and where possible, we want them to lead on this where they can. We want to reassure them that we understand their self-harming is helping them to cope at this time, and we want to help and support. Self-harm might be the only area in their life where they feel they have control. Do not focus on stopping, but use harm minimisation techniques. This is where we can start to put in place some next steps. Encouraging talking to others, either you, friends, other family members, professionals, or trusted staff in school. Using the self-harm cycle, you might explore with them how they feel before, during, and after, getting them to think about those triggers and emotions and what distraction techniques might help them. Because self-harm is helping your child to cope with difficult feelings, it is important to think of other ways they might manage their feelings. These can include distraction, stress management techniques, and thinking of alternative methods of releasing those extreme emotions. As you can see, there are some examples of these on the screen. Sometimes joining a social activity or sports group can also be a helpful distraction, as this can also provide a form of social support. Some people find that by using soothing or distraction techniques like these can decrease or remove the urge to harm themselves. Releasing difficult emotions in a physical way may also help with reducing the urge to self-harm, especially when we are experiencing those physical signs in our bodies alongside those difficult emotions in our minds. Again, these will be individual to the child and young person, and as parents and carers, you can explore with them what would help as a harm minimisation strategy. We want to help, support, and thank. We want to help them to realise the reasons and triggers for their self-harm and be available to help and reassure them in the best way we can. We want to support them in telling others if they want to and accessing other help with their self-harm, as well as working on distraction and coping techniques to support them. Talking about self-harm is a big deal, especially with the people we are closest to. Remember to thank them for confiding in you and explain you are always here when they need you. Self-care for you as parents and carers is just as important, as self-harm is extremely emotive and can be a lot for us to take on, especially as it is likely to be a long journey with potential relapses along the way. We cannot support effectively if we are not aware of our own needs and looking after ourselves, so that we can be there for our children in the best way we can. If you are working, it may be helpful to inform your employer if you feel you are able to do so. They may be able to provide you with additional support and hopefully have an understanding of your situation. There is a range of support for children and young people who self-harm, and these on the screen are just some examples. There are many different apps and online support networks available. Some children and young people find these easier to access rather than face-to-face support, as there is less pressure and they can dip in and out of these when they want to. They can generally remain anonymous on apps and do not have to disclose as many personal details as they would do face-to-face. Again, this can take the pressure off them and they can build up to discussing their self-harm when they are ready. Lots of apps can be used as distraction or coping techniques. For example, they could log into these when they feel the urge to self-harm to distract them from doing this. Sometimes keeping track of thoughts and feelings can help young people with their self-harm. Coo, for example, has a journaling feature on their app, which can be useful to keep track of feelings around self-harm, especially triggers for this and helpful coping strategies. If self-harm does escalate, it is important as parents and carers that we know what we need to do. If concerns around your child's self-harm increase and you notice a rise in anxiety or low mood, for example, you should seek further help. The best route is via the GP, who can refer on to more specialist support if needed. Telephone advice lines are a great source of support for parents and carers. If your child is in a mental health crisis and they are known to a locality team, they should be contacted in the first instance. If out of hours, you can call Mental Health Direct. For any minor injuries that require medical attention, drop-in health centres are the preferred route. If these are closed, A&E would be the default department. If your child goes to hospital for any reason related to self-harm, someone should talk to them about this and assess their mental well-being. Please ask staff if this does not happen. If your child has taken an overdose or has seriously harmed themselves, please ensure you call 999 if there is an immediate threat to life or danger. Thank you for attending this basic self-harm awareness session for parents and carers. I really hope this session has been useful for you. There is also a fact sheet on self-harm available from the Child Health Team, as well as additional resources to support emotional health and well-being. Finally, we have an online evaluation which we would really like you to complete for feedback, and we really welcome your views. Thank you.